You don't have to try to be something you're not.
Trying to be something I'm not? Trying to be proud of my African heritage? That's being something I'm not, then fine.
My grandmother was a full-blooded Iroquois.
I know all of that, Mama.
They don't know this. I am alive because of the blood of a people who never scraped or begged or apologized for what they were. They asked only one thing of this world: to be allowed to be. It broke my heart when you changed your name. I gave you my grandmother's name, a woman who bore 9 children and educated them all, who held off 6 white men with a shotgun when they tried to drag one of her sons off to jail for not knowing his place. And you had to reach into an African dictionary to find a name that would make you proud.
My father was raised in the era when black niggas couldn't claim Native American. Making music would've thought I had help, but the Indians I know wanna be the chief they self.
All right. Let me get some fists and feathers in the chat if you can hear me loud, crisp, and clear, and we'll go ahead and get this party started. Last night, the algorithm pushed an interesting video my way. I said, you know what? I should share it with all of you. The YouTube channel this is from is called Eagle Stream. We're going to hear from a Dr. Arwin D. Smallwood and a Michael Erir, or I'm probably butchering his last name. We'll just pretend like I never even tried. But the title of this video is Triracial Identity of Tuscarora and Other Native Americans. So we're going to get into it, guys. We're going to get into it. Smash the like button on the way in. Hit the Cash App or the PayPal if you support the mission. And let's proceed with the content.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Michael Ure Show. Our very special guest today is Dr. Arwin D. Smallwood. And Dr. Smallwood is the professor and chair of the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University Department of History and Political Science, and the Carter G. Woodson Distinguished Lecturer and I'll let him go into detail, Association for the Study of African American Life. So, Dr. Smallwood, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'll try to make it as brief as I can, but I'm a native of Eastern North Carolina. I grew up in Bertie County in a little place called Indian Woods. So my family and I grew up here, and both sides of the family, mother and father, are from here, and all of my ancestors for hundreds of years. Attended Bertie High School, North Carolina Central for my undergraduate degree in political science, master's in history from North Carolina Central, and then my PhD from the Ohio State University.
Okay, well, so today our topic, and it's going to be a really deep topic, and for the audience, just to let you know, if you have any questions, you need to put them in the chat, and we'll go back and get them towards the end of this presentation. If for some reason we go over a little bit, we will still answer your questions, and this is going to be a part 1 and a part 2 program. So I'm going to ask Sarah to just kind of move us over to the side, and we'll just start with our presentation.
Again, I want to thank you, Michael and Sarah, for advancing my slides for me, but for this invitation and opportunity to speak with your audience. And the title of the presentation is The Triracial Identity of Indians of North Carolina and Southeast Virginia. There's a historic relationship between the native peoples and even today the residents of Southeast Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. We'll touch on the Tuscarora Indians, the Meherrin Indians, and the Nottoway Indians. Both the Tuscarora and Meherrins are in North Carolina. The Nottoways are in Southeast Virginia. And then we'll touch on a few others in southeastern North Carolina near Hyde County, like the Bear River, Mattamuskeet, and Machapungas, and we'll touch on those. So next slide, please. And I'm going to try to answer a few questions. Next slide, please. And so the question.
No, I was going to say, at this particular slide, you're getting ready to do it. I just wanted to know if you could pronounce these different groups, because I noticed a lot.
Yes, and today we're going to be primarily focusing on the East Coast, the Carolinas. I know we got some folks watching right now who are from the Carolinas. This is going to be a deep dive into the rich Black indigenous history of that area. To be frank, And you know what? I should just go ahead and pull up Google Maps for just a second. To be frank, I am born and raised on the West Coast. So, if you're born and raised on the West Coast, I mean, that's a whole different world. That's a whole different lifestyle. That's a whole different section of geography. And when it comes to those natives, when it comes to even things like slavery, I mean, the West Coast has a vastly different history than the East Coast. For example, if I can share my screen here, we can see today, we're going to be focusing on the East Coast. Something that they're going to really touch base on is the fact that the first explorers, quote unquote explorers, we say invaders, right? The first explorers were not the Europeans from Britain. In fact, in the 15th century, it was the Spanish, it was the Spaniards from Spain, because again, this is the East Coast. If we look across here, what do we have? Spain. And nobody was taking a straight shot. Nobody at all was taking a straight shot across the North Atlantic. It wasn't feasible, just wasn't possible. Logistically, um, the ocean's gyres don't move that way. There's hurricanes, typhoons, you name it. So what they did is they went along the coast, went across to Brazil, went along the coast, made it to the West Indies, made it to the Americas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the first people to come over were the Spanish. And we're going to learn that they did a real dirty number on the indigenous folks. I mean, chopping off hands, chopping off limbs, subjugating them in more ways than one. And then when the Spanish leave, well, now a few years later, we have the British folks, the pilgrims, the colonists coming through. So we have to understand that the history of indigenous peoples in America is vastly different on the East Coast versus the West Coast. I mean, if we look at the West Coast, what's over here? We got China, Russia, Japan. Is there any surprise that a lot of the indigenous folks over here look a lot more mongoloid and Asiatic? Well, guess what? They say that there was three races of aboriginals. One were the blacks, two were the Asiatic looking ones who came across the Bering Strait, and three were the ones that were mixed with Russian and Asian, but were quote unquote still indigenous to North America. So we have to understand vastly different history between the West Coast and the East Coast. And today we are focusing on the East Coast. And before we proceed with the video, we actually have a live caller coming from the back to the front is Miles. Miles, let the people know where you're calling in from and what's on your mind.
What's up? It's Millie Hendricks. Yeah, I just thought I'd give up my government name a bit. So, yeah, this is quite an interesting thing. I'm just like very educational. I didn't know there was a difference between the East Coast and the West Coast Native Americans. So, yeah, that's just what I really want to know. And also, I want to know how the slave owning Native Americans coming to just the ones who were like pally pally with the Confederates and stuff. I just want to, because I read up a little bit about that. That's how I kind of know the difference between the Red Indians and the Black, indigenous Americans. Is that the like while they say the Black ones own slaves, but they were just trying to buy their families' freedoms, whereas the Red ones they actually owned slaves because they were real for it. So yeah, I'm just gonna be quiet and I'm just gonna like just be learn to be educated.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate you showing up to learn something new. And actually, what we're going to be focusing on, to be more specific, is not just the Aboriginals on the East Coast, but these are going to be the Native Black Americans that descend from those few slaves from Africa they brought over. And I say few slaves, it was actually 100,000 or 200,000, but in the grand scheme of things, it was about 4% of the total African slaves that were transported during the transatlantic slave trade. Only 4% went to North America. Now, we know when we talk about Native Black Americans, you've got two different types. You've got those that descend from the true Aboriginal Black Indians, and then you have those that descend from some of the African slaves that fled the plantation, joined indigenous tribes, intermarried, had children, and, coexisted with one another. So there's two different type of distinctions you have to make when you talk about Native Black Americans. And today we're going to be specifically talking about those Native Black Americans that descend from slaves transported from Africa. So let's go ahead and get on into the content. I'm gonna put you backstage, Millie, and then at a certain point I'll bring you back up to tap in with you, see if you have any questions. But let's get on with the video. Guys, make sure to hit the Cash App or the PayPal. If you're learning something new, go ahead and put 5 on it. And if anybody has questions or wants to call in and provide some commentary, the link is pinned to the top of the chat. Oh, and you know what? That was an epic fail. I just shared my screen the wrong way with no audio. There we go.
If you don't mind.
Sure, sure. So here you have the Machapungas, and again, the map shows the location of the Indians, and now I'll go through their, through the pronunciations. The Machapungas, you have the Bear River Indians, you have the Mattamuskeet Indians, the Choanoke or Chowan Indians, the Yupin, Hatteras, which are down in southeastern North Carolina coastal regions, the Core, the Roanoke Indians, which were on and along the Roanoke River, Moretuck Indians, also along the Roanoke River. Moretuck was also met Roanoke. The Noose Indians, the Pamlico, the Hoskeet, the Pasquotank, and then the Tuscaroras, Meharin, and Nottoway. And as you see on the map, the Tuscaroras are split into what we call the upper Tuscaroras and the lower Tuscaroras. And they and the Meharins and Nottoways, who are really of the same language group or families, like being French or German or English, they're of the same group, together created a pretty powerful confederation that stretched from southeast Virginia, kind of south of Petersburg, down into eastern North Carolina and down to the Cape Fear River. So
and what a lot of people may not realize, I didn't know this until just earlier in the week, but the United States government actually modeled their government off of the indigenous tribe called the Iroquois. So when they're talking about this confederacy was the Iroquois Confederacy, and the founding fathers of America literally took inspiration from this indigenous tribe and how they worked with one another when it came to deciding the governmental structure of the US of A. But they don't really talk about that, huh?
The earlier Indians that I mentioned that were basically Algonquin Indians, which is another language group, and then the Tuscarora Indians, Meharins, and Nottoways are Iroquois Indians, and then to the west of them we'll have some Siouan tribes. But these are the tribes that are concentrated in the eastern part of the state in southeast Virginia, and the places, the Indians that the English, when they settled or tried to settle North Carolina, and then did settle Jamestown, the region that they're coming, that these are the Indians that they would have engaged and encountered during that time.
And God damn it, I'm the king of receipts. So how dare I tell you something as profound as that the US of A governmental structure was modeled after Native American. How do I say something that profound and not show you guys some receipts? So go ahead. Let's take a look at some receipts, y'all. The framework of the government in the Iroquois Confederacy is said to have inspired Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and other founders as they wrote the Constitution. Y'all, did y'all know that Native Americans inspired the Constitution? I don't think a lot of you guys realize that. Put a 1 in the chat if you're just now learning this for the first time. Not only that, but the founders adopted the Iroquois Nation symbol, the bald eagle, as the new nation's national symbol. Did you know that our national symbol, the eagle, really they got that from the Iroquois Nation? And we're gonna get into the history, y'all. We we about to get into what's really real. When they said this land is your land, this land is my land, this land was made for you and me, they was talking about us, not them. Come on, let's get into it.
Next slide, please. So the questions that I have here, I'm going to go back over them, but there are 5 basic questions I'm going to try to answer. And those questions are basically going to look at and try to help you better understand what happened with indigenous people prior to the arrival of Europeans, how Europeans impacted, white Europeans impacted indigenous people, and then how the introduction of Africans as slaves impacted indigenous people, and then how those peoples basically create a new culture. And we talk about triracial culture or triracial people. We're going to kind of talk about these.
Guys, triracial people. Some of us are even more than triracial. Hey, the more I think about it, the more I get into the history, the more I feel that my lineage, to a degree, is the very embodiment of what it means to be an American. Do I have some African lineage? Most likely. Do I have indigenous lineage? Yes, Muscogee Creek Nation. Do I have some European lineage? Yes, them folks came from Germany. So when you really look into what it means to not just be an American, but even a Native American, Native Americans from the jump have been a multiracial people. But most people don't realize that. There was the black natives, there was the Mongoloid looking natives, and then there was the Russian Mongoloid looking natives. And then there was the real Niji, like my homie Jazz. Thank you for putting something in the brown paper bag. I appreciate the contribution.
Brown paper bag, brown paper bag, brown paper bag, brown paper bag.
Different aspects of things and how things happen. Next slide, please. So the first question that I'm going to try to answer is, what have we overlooked about Black and indigenous peoples in America, particularly in North Carolina and Virginia, when studying the centuries before 1619? And the answer to that question is a great deal. Native people in North Carolina and Virginia, before contact with Europeans, they did have a distinct culture, and I talked about the language groups. But once these peoples arrived, due to disease and warfare, many native peoples were reduced in number and in size, and oftentimes intermixed with runaway slaves and intermixed with white indentured servants, poor whites who were fleeing oppression from Virginia, and they created, new communities and new societies. This happened independently, but it also happened on plantations, and it even happened in the actual settlements themselves. And I'll touch on.
Yes, guys, did you know plantations had white slaves, African slaves, and Aboriginal slaves? Did you guys know that a lot of those slaves revolted and they formed maroon groups, Galageechee-S groups, Seminole-S groups, where they mix with the natives? So now you've got indigenous folks mixed with African folks, mixed with European folks. Guys, we've always been a mixed people from the jump.
I want to talk a little bit about that as I go through the presentation. But you also have to go back to talk about the impact of Europeans. We all start our history in North Carolina with the English and even in Virginia, but really that history starts with the Spanish. And the Spanish will have a profound impact on the Chesapeake, on Virginia, on Eastern North Carolina and Western North Carolina. And I'm going to touch on some of those today in this presentation. Next slide, please. So natives of Virginia and North Carolina at first contact. Next slide. So as I mentioned at the start, if you look at North Carolina, and this is a map of the eastern United States, pretty much native nations east of the Mississippi River, there were several major language groups in North America at the time of the arrival of European. Now, the language groups basically are just representing the fact that people spoke a language that was the same and they could communicate with one another. As I said before, it's like the French language or English or German or Russian. They're different language groups. Now, if you know anything about African nations or European history, you know that in world history, you could have many different Russians who speak different types of Russian, Russian of the Russian language of Russian, or many different types of English who speak different dialects or different types of English, right? So even today in America, we have a certain dialect that we speak. In England, it's different. And then if we look at Australia, which is another, English colony, their, dialect is a little different. So the language is basically the same and people can understand each other, but there are differences in dialect. So if you look at this map and you look at North Carolina, in eastern North Carolina, you had Algonquin peoples who spoke the Algonquin language. But although they were different peoples and different nations of people, they spoke the same language and they could understand and communicate with one another. Then to the west of them were the Iroquois people. I mentioned the Tuscaroras, the Meharans, and the Nottaways. They're highlighted in yellow, coming down from Petersburg and Richmond, Virginia, stretching throughout eastern North Carolina. And then in the western part of the state, in the mountains, you'll have the Cherokees, who also were Iroquoian and originally actually separated from what we call the Haudenosaunee people or the Iroquois people, and then settled in Tennessee and in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee. Next slide, please. Most of the native peoples who end up coming into North Carolina. So before we start talking about triracials or talking about native people and their impact or mixes with Africans, we have to talk about the societal structures. Even today, if you look in Southeast Virginia, Northeastern North Carolina, these Indian nations are named for the river systems that still exist and drain into the Albemarle Sound, beginning with the Nottoway River in Virginia, where the Nottoway Nation primarily settled, going down towards the Chowan. You have the Meharan River, where the Meharan nations settled as you come into North Carolina, and they converge into the Chowan. And then you have the Roanoke River, and then from the Roanoke, again, the Chowan come together into the Albemarle Sound. Native peoples used rivers to, of course, fish, to trade.
And this is why I say that there's such a distinct difference between the Aboriginal history of the natives on the East Coast versus the West Coast. These East Coast natives, they've migrated, settled, and been rehomed even as far north as Canada. To this day, there are Black Indigenous folks that have whole communities in Canada because during a certain point of American history, they fled up to Canada seeking a better life. So yeah, the East Coast Aboriginal history is definitely completely different from the West Coast.
To travel, and they settled on the banks of these rivers. They had gardens where they grew the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. But cultures, basically revolve around these various rivers. Next slide, please. And for the Iroquois people, that includes not just the river systems of Southeast Virginia and Northeastern North Carolina, but it also includes the river systems of Central Eastern North Carolina, the Tar River, the Neuse River. Next slide, please. And also the Cape Fear River. So Tuscaroras in particular are along the Cape Fear, they're along the Tar and the Neuse, but they are scattered throughout eastern North Carolina, pretty much from Raleigh and Durham to the coast, and even the Greensboro region, Guilford County, you'll see Tuscaroras being hunting and traveling throughout that region as well. Next slide, please. And I put this slide in just to talk about the Southeastern Indians because there's great interaction between between the Tuscaroras, who are considered Northeastern Indians, Northeastern Woodland Indians, and the Southeastern Woodland Indians. And that pretty much is the divide of this river system, the PD River system. Those Indians south of the PD River tend to be what we would consider Southeastern Indians, the Catawba Indians, the Yamasee Indians, the PD, and a number of other smaller tribes. But that's kind of the dividing point between the North Carolina.
And we got Gear Girl coming through with a contribution on the Cash App. I appreciate the support, darling. Just for you, we can go ahead and cue up that special tune.
Brown paper bag, brown paper bag.
Carolina Indians or the Northeastern Indians and the Southeastern Indians, who tended to be Siouan Indians in South Carolina and in the Piedmont of South Carolina and North Carolina. Next slide, please. So when we start talking about the triracials and we start talking about these native groups, it's important for us to, again, understand the geography of North Carolina and Virginia and its neighbor, South Carolina, understand the native nations and where they were situated, and understand that just like today, the state of North Carolina has a relationship with Virginia, it has a relationship with South Carolina, the United States has a relationship with Canada, and it has a relationship with Mexico. Native nations had relationships. They had trading partnerships. They had a lot military alliances with one another to protect each other. So again, when we look at Southeast Virginia, and although the people of Southeast Virginia, there's a mix of Iroquoian and Algonquin peoples, again, these peoples did interact with one another, and they did maintain alliances with one another, and they maintained communication with one another as it pertains to the introduction of Europeans into their regions, as well as the introduction of Africans later. So we have to understand that there was a thriving culture of native peoples that existed prior to the arrival of Europeans. And then when the Europeans arrived, they will have a tremendous impact on those cultures and really turning many societies upside down. Next slide, please. So the reason I focus on Tuscaroras, Meharans, and Nottaways when we start talking about, nations that are, are triracial nations, I'm going to give you a couple examples why, but that is one of the most influential nations of Indians that are in North Carolina during this particular time period. And the Nottaways, the Tuscaroras, and the Meharans are Iroquois, as I said before, and they are, connected by blood to what we call the Iroquois Confederacy. Collectively, they are called the Haudenosaunee people, and they maintain their connections with those people throughout before the arrival of Europeans and even after the arrival of Europeans. In fact, many Tuscaroras after the Tuscarora War will leave North Carolina and relocate in New York State and Pennsylvania, and they will officially be recognized by the British government as the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy, which was the most powerful Indian confederation in the history of North America.
And that's that same confederacy that the U.S. Constitution was inspired by. Come on, y'all. Let's learn a little something today. Let's learn something.
These routes show the migration pattern that as one people, they migrated out of the Mississippi River Valley, out of the great city of Cahokia, ancient city of Cahokia, move east, separate into what becomes known as the Six Nations or Five Nations, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and then in North Carolina, three nations, the Tuscaroras, the Nottaways, and the Meharans. And then again, there are nations to the south of them that I mentioned before, the Cherokee, who actually were Haudenosaunee originally, but separated and moved into Tennessee. But then down in the southeast, their neighbors, the Creeks, the Catawbas, the Yamasees, the Santee, and then to the west towards Tennessee and Mississippi, you have the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to read all of these, but this is a detailed listing of all of the Native Americans that were in the coastal plains of North Carolina at the time of first contact between the English or Europeans, Spanish, the English, and other Europeans. These are all of the nations of Indians that would have been in contact, would have been in place during that first contact. Now, I've gone over several of them already, so if you're looking at the slide presentation, you see that we've talked about the Moratucks and the Roanoks and the Chowanoks or Chowan. So we've talked about most of these Indians, but I'm just restating them here so that people have a very clear understanding of the many different nations of Indians that existed in eastern North Carolina. And
it looks like we've got a question in the chat. Van says, how would it be logical for millions of indigenous Black people to mix with a few Africans? That wouldn't be logical to do today, even ratio-wise. A few of us could be mixed, but not all. So when we say that there were Native American tribes that mixed in with the Africans, you're right. It was few and far in between. I mean, they say only 92,000 to 150,000 slaves actually came to North America from Africa. So you're right. If we've got Native American tribes intermixing with some of these Africans, it's not the vast majority. I mean, I'm not saying that the vast majority of Black Americans descend from a mixture of African slaves and Native indigenous folks. No, 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 no. I think it's the opposite. I think most of us have indigenous Aboriginal heritage, and some of us also have some African lineage due to that admixture. But nah, you're totally right. I do not believe that the vast majority of Black Americans descend from African slaves, but do the vast majority of Black Americans descend from people who endured slavery? Absolutely. They even tell us that in Virginia and other states, they reclassified Native Americans and called them Negroes and other slaves and placed them on plantations right alongside African and white slaves. So, do all of us come from Africa? No. Are most of us descendants from slaves? Yes. Were a lot of those slaves Black natives? Yes. So let's talk about it.
Some cases, Southeast Virginia, during the time of first contact. Next slide, please. And that's just a continuation of all of the different Indian groups that would be found in the Piedmont of North Carolina. So you have the Tidewater regions of North Carolina, which is pretty much from the mouths of the rivers, the Roanoke, the Tar, the Neuse, the Cape Fear, and the Chowan rivers eastward. Those are Tidewater Indians. And then from the mouth of those rivers up to around Raleigh, just west of Rocky Mount, would be considered the coastal plains. And then you had your coastal plains Indians, which we just looked at that slide. Then we have the Piedmont Indians. So from Raleigh westward into the Piedmont before you get to the mountains, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, the Charlotte area, but the Piedmont, these are the nations of Indians that you would find there in that area. The Occaneechees, the Saponis, and the Halawa, the Tutelos, but again, a number of different Indians that would be found in the Piedmont regions of North Carolina and also Virginia and South Carolina. And then in the mountains of North Carolina, of course, again, there are the Cherokees. Cherokees really were in the valley in Tennessee, what is the Tennessee Valley, really Cherokees mostly in Tennessee, between the Tennessee River, what was called at one time the Cherokee River, which stretches from the western part of Tennessee to the east. So that's kind of the breakdown of Native peoples and Native cultures in North Carolina. And that's really kind of our starting point as we begin to talk about, well, when and why and how do these intermixes occur between Native Americans, Africans, and Europeans. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to try to very briefly talk about the impact of the Spanish. Next slide.
Yeah, guys, viewer discretion is advised. This is where the story is going to take a very dark turn for the worse. Them Spaniards, oh Lord, them Spanish folks did even worse to the natives than what the Europeans did.
If we were to look at North America, and I just tried to briefly explain that there's a distinction between the Northeast and the Southeastern Indians, and that divide is the Cape Fear River. The Indians north of the Cape Fear River, including the Tuscaroras and the Indians of Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, were considered Northeastern Indians. And the Indians south of the Cape Fear, the Catawba, the Santee, the Yamasees, are considered to be Southeastern Indians. So if we were to look at a map of North America, and specifically the American South, at the start, at first contact in 1492, we have a makeup that's something like this, because the Tuscaroras are one of the largest and most powerful groups of Indians, and they kind of dominate trade and relationships in North Carolina between the Indians of North Carolina and their neighbors in Virginia. Next slide, please.
I'm going to interrupt.
Yes.
Could you tell us about the Tuscarora Eye? That's one. And the second one about the settlements on former Indian capitals of what are cities now. And then I know you got to go through a lot, and we're almost we're at the halfway point, and I know we got a long way to go, but I just wanted to ask those questions really quick. Go ahead.
Okay. So the question that Michael is asking, Mr. Uri is asking, amongst the Tuscarora people, because they intermixed with Europeans early, and they're one of the groups that claims responsibility for the destruction and absorption of the lost colony. Many members of the Tuscarora Nation were born.
Did you hear that, guys? Did you hear that? This Native American faction absorbed a colony of Europeans. A hindsight being 2020, we can judge them as harshly as we want, but a lot of these Native Americans adopted foreigners into their tribe, adopted Europeans into the tribe, allowed their tribal women to intermarry with European and Spanish foreign. Hey, we're gonna get into it, y'all. We're gonna get into it. Maybe the Native Americans was just a little bit too nice.
With blue eyes, green eyes, gray eyes, and sometimes with auburn hair. If you've ever seen people with kind of reddish hair, it's like a reddish auburn hair. But this eye became known amongst the Six Nations and among other Indian nations as the Tuscarora eye because it was so prevalent amongst the Tuscarora. Remembering most Native people had black hair and they had brown eyes, right? And so the Tuscaroras distinguished themselves amongst their neighbors who are Algonquins or other Iroquois Indians, and even the Siouan Indians, because there were so many of their members that had these characteristics. And no matter where they migrated to, whether it was New York State, Canada, Louisiana, no matter where they migrated, even scattered throughout parts of Eastern North Carolina, they still carried those characteristics with them. And you'll see those who end up intermarrying more heavily with African Americans. You'll see dark-skinned African Americans with blue eye, piercing blue eyes. You see them of all different shades of color in terms of skin color, but the eyes, are pretty consistent amongst the Tuscarora themselves, as well as the whites and the Africans that they were found to have intermarried with. And then the other question that Michael is asking is a result of the Tuscarora War, which which is much later than this period. We're in the colonial period now, the early colonial period during first contact with the Spanish and English. But the Tuscarora War occurs in 1711, from 1711 to 1713. And after the Tuscarora War and the defeat of the Tuscarora, about a third of the Tuscarora were killed, another third were enslaved. The others became refugees and fled North Carolina and were scattered from Virginia through Pennsylvania into New York State and even over into Canada. And you still see the remnants of that migration. If you go throughout the western part of Maryland, you'll find counties named Tuscarora, high schools named Tuscarora. You get into Pennsylvania, you'll have the Tuscarora Mountains in Pennsylvania. In New York State, you'll have, Tuscarora Mountain and Slide Mountain. So this forced migration out of North Carolina and back to the lands of their ancestors in New York State and Pennsylvania will leave, in marks all along the landscape from North Carolina, to Pennsylvania and to New York, as well as Canada. Even the Tuscarora Trail, which goes up through the mountains, through West Virginia, Maryland, and through Pennsylvania, still bears the name of the Tuscaroras who left North Carolina after the defeat in that war. In fact, the Tuscarora Trail is called the Death Trail because so many Tuscaroras died in that forced migration out of North Carolina at the close of the Tuscarora War between 1713 and 1715. This image represents, and I know we're going to wind down in a moment, represents the Spanish and their conquests of the Americas and the conquistadors, their explorations of the Americas. Next slide, please. And it's important for people to understand that the Spanish were in North America first, that the Spanish, did detailed maps of the southeastern part of the United States, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina. They mapped.
And on previous streams I've actually went into text from Spanish explorers where they said that they saw natives that were Negro. They said that they came with some Negro servants and they told their Negro servant to go give a biscuit to some of the natives, and the natives were really excited to see the Negro, and they said, hey, we live with a tribe of Negroes who live not too far from here. So the Spanish were the first ones here, and they even have accounts of seeing native Black Americans.
Indian nations and Indian villages. So the Spanish had a great knowledge of the native peoples of North America. Next slide, please. But Very few people, I think, understand that the Spanish also had incursions into North Carolina. That the Spanish raided the coast of North Carolina for slaves. There was a very brisk Native American slave trade that was conducted by the Spanish, in which they enslaved Native women and children, particularly women. They shipped them back to Europe to serve as concubines and sex slaves for the Europeans. So there was a very brisk slave trade in the British in the Caribbean that the Spanish controlled before the British arrived, in Mexico and in Central America, as well as in North America. And so, as this map illustrates, the Spanish were all along the coast of North Carolina. They raided villages along the coast in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. They attempted to plant settlements, and it did establish colonies in Florida and in Florida, South Carolina, and also Virginia. I think very few people realize, along with DeSoto and Pardo's expeditions into the western part of North Carolina, where they spread disease and attacked Indians, very few people realize that in 1570, the Spanish established a mission, a Catholic church in what is now Jamestown, Virginia, and attempted to convert the Indians of Virginia to Catholicism. And so they had a tremendous impact on the native peoples of North Carolina and Virginia and South Carolina, but throughout the Southeast, that will lead to mixing between Indians, Africans, and Europeans. Next slide, please. These are just examples of the expeditions in the western part of North Carolina and the forts that were set up in South Carolina and North Carolina. Next slide, please. And then the campaigns through that region. I mean, if you look at these drawings were done by Bartholomew, who accompanied the Spanish conquistadors in their campaigns in North Carolina and throughout the Americas. Different native.
Peep game, guys, peep game. This is a portrayal of conquistadors taking over, basically destroying a indigenous village. Look at the houses. Aboriginal people didn't live in no teepees. Some lived in teepees, very few. A couple lived in teepees, as far as like a couple tribes across North America. But look at these houses, these elongated houses. Interesting. But modern day, they want you to think that, most Native Americans lived in some kind of teepee of sort. Guys, peep game, peep game. There was three types of Indians. The first, the original, were the Anasazi, aka the Amerindian, aka the Negro people. When the Spanish people came over, they called them Negros de Terras, the blacks of the land. These are the oldest and largest population of over 500 million. As a collective of people, they developed a culture and civilization called the North to Southeastern Mound Builders. Yes, when we talk about the pyramid structures, when we talk about the fact there's more pyramids in the Americas than there is in Africa, God damn it, the Anasazi, the Black Indians, they were the mound builders, the Eastern Woodland people. And guess what? There was two other races of Indians. The second is the Southwestern Plains. These are the first immigrants. They're not really native, they're just the first immigrants, migrating people from Asia into the Central Plains, the Navajo, the Pueblo. They're very small, Asian looking, right? That's why there's those Asian looking, quote unquote, Native Americans. Then you've got the Alaskan people, which are Anasazi slash Asian. They're a mixed population. So, guys, there was multiple type of ethnicities of Native Americans. And when it says that the Southwestern Plains ones are people who migrated from Asia, hey, I'm gonna give you a little bit of homework on your free time. Google a Siberian teepee. If you Google a Siberian teepee, oh shoot, damn, that looked just like the quote unquote Native American teepee. Wow. And it's not a conspiracy, it's not a mystery. We know for a fact that there were Asians that came through the Bering Strait, right? They say at one point in time this was iced over. Come on. This is the West Coast. This is Canada. This is Alaska. Now we're over in Russia. We got Mongolia. We got Asia, right? So the Asians are the first to migrate over here, and they're in the southeastern, excuse me, was it southeastern or was it southwestern? They're in the southwestern area, and it just so happens that those tribes were the ones that lived in teepees, teepees that are identical to Siberian teepee tents. Okay, all right. Hey, what is it that Dane used to say? I'm just here to make you think. Come on, y'all. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it.
Villages look different. The way they built their houses were different. Very clear from this illustration that these are longhouses. The Iroquois built longhouses. And so you can tell Tuscarora, Meherrin, Nottoway houses, as well as the rest of the Six Nations from other Indian nations, because they had a distinct look. Next slide, please. But the Spanish attacked these houses and attacked these people, seizing their food supplies, burning and destroying their communities, taking their women and children. Next slide, please. And generally intimidating the people, using war dogs to hunt people down, rip them to pieces. I apologize again for some of these slides, they're graphic, but these are the things that happened to Native people by the Spanish in the Southeast, but also in North Carolina. Next slide, please. They murdered chiefs, like I said, they raided their villages, they burned houses, took belongings. Next slide, please. And again, to intimidate and instill fear in Native communities throughout the Southeast, but particularly in North Carolina and Virginia. Next slide, please. So you see the graphic nature of this, the burning alive of Native people, the hanging of chiefs and clan mothers, the taking of their children and women. Again, it's a very violent campaign. Next slide, please. This is an image of Native people's hands and feet being chopped off, by the Spanish. Now, before I found these images, there was at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, they have, oral recorded, audio recorded and transcribed histories by Tuscaroras that were told, to observers. And one of those histories, one of those stories is about the handless maiden, about the fact that there was this young girl, beautiful young girl, whose hands had been chopped off. Now, I thought that was just some type of metaphor. I thought that was a story that was just told to young kids to kind of, keep them on the right path. But when I found these drawings by Bartholomew, I understood that this was actually a true event.
Yes, you heard that right, ladies and gentlemen. A handless maiden. They took a beautiful young indigenous girl and chopped off her hands. Why? Because the Spaniards were terrorists.
That it actually had happened, and it had stayed with the Tuscarora people for generations, and it was recorded in their stories that were passed down from generation to generation. Next slide, please. And so most of this is happening in the western part of North Carolina, coming up through South Carolina. So this is the Spanish region that is affected by these campaigns by the Spanish. And it's important to understand that one of the results of this is alliances, right? Traditionally, the Catawba Indians and the Siouan Indians were enemies of the Iroquoian Indians, the Tuscaroras, Meherrins, and Nottoways. But because of this campaign by the Spanish, we're going to see shifting alliances in the West. And so the Tutelos and the Saponis, they will end up falling into alliance with the Tuscaroras. And we'll see that they are pretty much in alliance with the Iroquois right on down through the 1700s. And if you go to Grand River Six Nation reserves today in Canada, you'll still find Tutelos and Saponis living amongst the Six Nations as allies and as friends. And whereas with the Catawba remain at odds with the Tuscaroras and they remain enemies. But this region here, what we're talking about between that separates the lands of the Tuscaroras or the Iroquois people from the Siouan people, these campaigns lead to some major political, realignments, not to mention the changes in the populations due to the impact of disease as well as warfare during this time period. Next slide, please. So the mixing of people, and I know I'm out of time. I'm probably already out of time, so I'm running low on time. So I'm going to just now throw in and help you understand that this mixing begins as early as 1492 and between 1492 and 1584, and it only increases after the English come to North Carolina, explore, and create the Roanoke settlement on Roanoke Island. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand that the Spanish for almost 100 years have been in the Americas, exploiting the Caribbean, exploiting Central America, Mexico, the southeastern United States, the coast of North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, and Florida. And they are taking Native people, particularly Native women, out, and they're taking them back to Europe, and they're selling them in Europe as slaves. And they are beginning to import Africans into the Caribbean and even into Florida. One of the other things I think it's important to know.
Yes, guys, I'm sure many of you were not aware that the first slave trade or transporting of slaves was transporting the Aboriginal folks in America to Europe. The Spaniards took some natives and took them as slaves back to Europe. So, God damn it, when they say that there's some people who are quote unquote black folks that have been in Europe for hundreds of years, I wonder.
Note here is that many of the Africans who came originally with the Spanish and end up in Florida and parts of the Americas actually are coming as conquistadors, as soldiers. And if you look at Fort St. Augustine's, where Jacksonville, Florida is established today, Fort St. Augustine's was a fort that was garrisoned by all African soldiers under the Spanish flag.
Did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen? When the Spaniards invaded, they had African conquistadors. There was Africans over here with the Spaniards burning down, raping, and pillaging indigenous natives. Damn, history is oh so nuanced. And then years and years later, some of them Africans are now over here in America as slaves, and they flee, and the tribes accept them with open arms and intermarry and intermix. But some of them Africans years prior were conquistadors working with the Spaniards.
And it was their job to basically pacify the Indians in the southeast and protect the road to Zacatecas. So it's important to understand that there was a lot of Africans have been brought even as far north as what is now Paris Island. I think it's called Fort Juan, what is now Paris Island in South Carolina. Large numbers of Africans were brought to that location and were there. So there were Africans introduced all throughout Florida, South Carolina, parts of Georgia, even as far north as Virginia and North Carolina. But Africans have been introduced into the hemisphere, clearly in the Caribbean, in South America, Central America, in Mexico. And these Africans, as slaves on plantations, intermix with Indians who had been enslaved, but they also intermix, in the frontier as they ran away from plantations, and even as soldiers that settled in the Americas. A very complex, stratified society in Spanish America when we talk about race mixing, and some of that finds its way into North America and into Eastern North Carolina. Next slide, please. So again, Indians, Africans, and whites, poor whites who are indentured servants, which are basically white slaves, brought to the Americas, also to Virginia, basically want a better life, and they want freedom too, so they run away. And these three groups on the plantations as slaves, in runaway communities, what we call maroon communities, and also in Indian villages, because Indians took in runaway Africans and took in runaway white indentured servants who did not want to live as people of in servitude to white elites. And all these people intermarried in these isolated maroon communities or runaway slave communities in these Indian villages, and then through force on plantations where they were all being forced to work together as slaves on plantation. So there was mixing occurring all throughout the Americas, all throughout Virginia and North Carolina as a result of these practices. Next slide, please. So we will see that overlapping of culture, the creolization of North Carolina culture between Native Americans and Africans. And this is where we get our triracial isolates. We know about mulattoes, people, and mulattoes originally were a mix of Indian and white, but we understand it as a mix of white and black. But mulatto could be a mix of Indian and white, Indian and black, or Indian and white. So it was just, we have all these overlaps. You have whites and Indians that are mixed. You have blacks and whites that are mixed. You have blacks and Indians that are mixed, black Indians, and then you have your triracial isolates who are of the bloodline of all three. Next slide, please. So this just illustrates, you know, the migration, and we're going to move quickly through these slides. This is the Middle Passage. Africans, as the African slave trade accelerates, we have more and more Africans being brought into the Americas, and they find their way into North Carolina. Next slide, please. And again, this is from the raiding of African villages in Africa for slaves. Next slide. Their ordeal was not unlike the ordeal of Native people in terms of the slave trade. Next slide, please. And so it's important to understand that during the slave trade, after the slave trade, and after Africans are brought to the Americas, next slide, that there is going to be a mutual understanding of the cruelties that Europeans have perpetrated against these people. Next slide, please. So the Africans who are forcibly brought from Africa and forced to work on plantations in the Americas, and the native people who have been exploited and intimidated and enslaved and shipped the opposite way back to Europe, these people actually forge alliances and friendships. They are both being exploited, and they both understand it, and they've both been brutalized. And so they actually forge alliances. So it's these, you know, and so it's important to understand in the first, you know, 100 years, 200 years of colonization and the development of Americas, the relationship between Indians and Africans was a much closer relationship than I think many people realize. Next slide, please. You know, they are suffering the same, you know, oppression. They're suffering the same exploitation. And so for Africans and Indians who are enslaved on plantations together, it was a natural understanding that they forged friendships and alliances. And when Africans were able to escape and Indian slaves were able to escape, again, they all could tell the same stories about how they were, you know, how they were abused under the institution of slavery. Next slide, please. So the English, so Michael, you have to tell me, I'm thinking we're out of time now, we're way over time. So you have to stop me because we can keep going with this, but
we're out of.
Come on, y'all, let's get into it. So we've spent some time diving deep into the Spaniards' impact on the northeast landmass of the United States and how the Aboriginal people suffered because of it. Now let's see what the English folks did. Come on, everybody knows about the English folks coming over and what they did, but many don't realize the number that the Spaniards did on us before the Europeans even showed up.
Special time, but we're going to go. That's very important, and I think we're going to try to get up to the Tuscaroran War. But if we don't, this is a good place that I think we definitely need to talk
about.
Go ahead.
Much of what I've just talked about is really the early intermixing between Africans and Native Americans and Europeans, which create triracial peoples on plantations, in independent societies or maroon societies that are free of slavery, and also in the communities, the established white settlements, right? So this is happening, like I said, from 1492 until the 1580s when the English attempt to establish their colonies. So for 100 years, we have a lot of racial mixing taking place, right? And it's not just in Central America, South America, Mexico, it's happening even in Florida and even as far north as southeastern North Carolina and South Carolina. Next slide, please. But then we have the coming of the English, right? The English are coming to Roanoke Island and they are exploring the river systems of northeastern North Carolina and of eastern North Carolina, and they're making contact with the native peoples that are in that region. Next slide. So we know from John White's drawings that, you know, and from the writings about early exploration of eastern North Carolina, well documented, you know, the coastal areas. This is a map of eastern North Carolina. It shows clearly the Outer Banks. It shows Roanoke Island. It shows the Albemarle Sound. It shows the Roanoke River and the Chewan River. You have to turn it sideways.